Hi, everyone, and welcome to a new session with Code with Sally. The session currently run every Thursday at 12 p.m. Eastern Time. If anyone is just joining us today for the first time or watching the session online, I would encourage you to go to YouTube, check Code with Sally channel, subscribe so you can get notified whenever we upload a new video. For the session, you'll find a playlist called English Series for Beginner. I upload the videos, the oldest first. I would encourage you to go through them if you have time, because the structure of the sessions was to start with the basics, and every time we build on top of it. So today, if you have any questions and you are attending live, please ask me. But if you are watching offline, please go back to the previous sessions and check the video related to the topic you want to understand more. Today is a new start. We are still in the beginner series, but we will be discussing in depth error handling and what are the exceptions. We touch base upon exceptions and how to catch it and how to handle it in previous videos while we are discussing other topics. But I wanted to give it like main focus and have it as a topic on its own, because it's very important and you will be dealing with exceptions and error handling in every project and every code you will be writing. So again, if you have any questions, please stop me, because it's very important to understand what we are covering and discussing. First of all, for anyone who's not really aware of what is error handling or what are exceptions. So exceptions are unexpected events that usually disturb the code. That means like you are expecting, for example, the user, if you are writing a calculator, for example, you are expecting a user to enter, like if they are doing division, they will say enter 10 divided by 2. But you're not expecting them to enter, for example, divided by 0. So if they enter divided by 0, this will throw an exception or cause an exception to happen. And if you don't handle it in a clean way, you will have it as unhandled exception, and it will be ugly to see the output on the screen. If you handle it, that's where you can manage like what's the type of the error. You will give it to the user, nice message explaining what they need to do. So exceptions again are something that is unexpected. Like when you are doing a division, you are not expecting to have divided by 0. So that's the main concept. Apex uses exceptions to signal that there is something wrong happening. So if you are trying to insert an account without a name and name is required, it would throw an exception to let you know I cannot do the action you want me to do. Like you asked me to insert, but I have nothing to insert. You're missing a required field. So it's a way for Apex and the code to like signal an error and tell you that there is something wrong and you need to do something. So it's unexpected behavior or something unexpected happen, and it needs to let you know that there is an issue. So that's exception. Exception handling is identifying where exception can happen, catch it, so you can do something with the exception. Like instead of throwing an ugly message to the user, you can return a nice message. Or you may have a logger, a logging system in your org, whether it's custom or you have an AppExchange app that logs exception. Maybe you are using that. So exception handling or error handler is when you catch an exception when it happened and you decide what to do with it. Maybe you will send an email, maybe you will enter an entry in a custom log object in Salesforce, or use like there is an AppExchange called Nebula. Maybe you are using it to log the error for you. So that's what do you want to do with the exception when it happened? Without handling, the behavior of the system can be unexpected. For example, maybe if you're using LWC, an exception can happen. Maybe the spinner will be, and you have a spinner on the screen, maybe it will freeze and you will keep having the spinner until you refresh the page. Instead of that, maybe we want to give the user a nice error message and close the spinner so the user can, for example, if they are missing a value, they can enter the value. So with handling exceptions, we can control what do we want to do, and we can show meaningful messages and not to be confused. So that's the main objective. Like, we want to stop the system from crashing. If we wanted to keep going, we can do that, and to provide useful information for the user in terms like whether it's like the developer, so they know that there is an exception happened in this class, in this line, so they go and check it, or for the end user to know, for example, if they messed up the data. Let's see quickly an example on, like I prepared here, error handling example. It's a class, and I prepared in a two static methods, one without any error handling, and another one with the try and catch. And don't worry about the syntax. We have a slide specifically for the syntax, but I just want you to see live what's the difference between unhandled exception, because here we are dividing by 0. So there is an exception that will happen. It will be unhandled because we don't have a try and catch. And let's see it together. So I will open here the execute anonymous, and I will execute the class.unhandled error demo. And we have, this is a static. So with static methods, we call it directly with the class name. So if I do this, see here, it tells me like there is an error. It stopped. Like if I had other line of codes after, like, for example, let me add the line of code for you here, system.debug, checking demo. If I have other line of code that maybe I don't want it to stop, if this gave me an exception, I still wish for it to run. If I do the execute, this line will never be executed. We had an unhandled exception. We get system.MathException telling me the line, what's the error. With this error message, for this case, it's simple and it's easy to understand, but sometimes the error message is very long. And for non-technical users who are using your system, will be confusing. Let's, instead of unhandled, I will call the other method that has the try and catch. I just want you to get the sense that when you try and catch, that allows you to, maybe for your code to continue executing if you wanted to do. And at the same time, the error message that will log here, we are logging when the exception will happen, we'll log the error message in the debug log. It will be more clear, and like you can hear, we are just getting the get a message, but maybe we will can type the text that we want. So if we do the execute here, now I can open the debug log because my code, like we code the error and we can still execute the rest of it. So handled error, now this is handled error. The unhandled was the message that got popped up and the code got terminated. But here I got the handled error message that we typed, and I got the checking demo that I had here in the debug log. So that's the main difference we have to keep in mind, like handled versus unhandled. And for anyone who's joining, like this is something new we are doing. Like I started a GitHub. After the session, all the code that we will have in the session, especially the classes, will be in the error handling basics 01. So you can, like, instead of copying and pasting for you and losing in the chat history in Slack, we'll have it on GitHub. And I will share the link with the video as well. So that's just like we are starting to understand what is error or exceptions and what do we mean by handling. Until now, Anyone has any questions?
Yeah, I just posted one question. I'm curious with setting up exceptions in the cases where your code is not showing any type of error by default, but it is failing. What's like some guidelines to create the right exception for when something is failing quietly? That's been an area that's been hard for me to understand.
Okay, let me understand your question. So when you mean like it will fail quietly, is it because the exception is happening maybe in the trigger or in a batch class that is running asynchronous? Is that what you mean? Or you mean that you're not handling the exception or just handling handling it but not doing anything with it?
Okay, so to describe the case that inspired the question, I was creating a invocable class to do a custom lead conversion. In both running my test class and in both running it in the flow and debug mode, I was able to go through the flow or go through the test class without a failure coming through, but the lead did not convert.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's like, okay, I know somewhere there is an error and
Okay.
somewhere there is a place that an exception should be caught,
Mm-hmm.
but I don't know like how to spot that out in the best way and put that in to test against if that helps clarify.
Okay, so it's hard like to be 100% sure of what's happening without checking the class with you. But let's say, and I saw this sometimes, like sometimes, for example, people do their try and catch, like what we have here, but they don't have a debug statement. And even with system.debug, that kind of sort of it's like failing silently because in order for you to see it you need to have a logger active with your user, and it's valid usually maximum for 24 hours. So let's say another user is running your code, they may get an exception but they don't have the log enabled, so you won't see it. So usually, first of all, like you never have a catch like empty like this. So you saw when we opened the debug log, when we had it, the system.debug, we were able to see the error. But if let's say I do here, I will see that I'm checking demo, but I don't see the exception anymore. So sometimes some developers forget to handle the exception. So even though they are handling it, but they are not doing anything meaningful with the exception. So sometimes that's an issue. If someone has like their class with a try and catch and the catch is empty, so that will lead to what you are seeing, for example, that you cannot see something in the debug log telling you what's the exception. Plus, the other way is that if you don't have a logger active and you're just writing in the system.debug, that's something as well. Sometimes like it's hard to reproduce the error or to catch what happened because, for example, another user ran the code today at 10 a.m. I don't know what happened and the logger wasn't active for their user. So the good practice as well here is like to log the error in, let's say, custom object. Sometimes people do their custom object for exceptions and write their scheduler class to empty this object and they keep an eye on the records in this, or to use an App Exchange app like Nebula or something that comes with its own like objects and its own scheduler that will clear it. So you need to have a way, or for example, or send email if that's what you want. But usually I don't do that. Like I either like with the team I'm working with, we have our custom object to store the errors, or we have our utility, how to log it, and what details we catch, like which line, which method, which class, and so on, or the App Exchange app. So it depends on how it's handled. So if you have a try and catch and the catch is empty, you will have the scenario you have. If you have the catch with just system.debug and you don't have the logger active, that will cause the same, like you won't see the error. You need to have the log for your user enabled, or for the user it's running with, to see it. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, that actually does really help. Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay. Any other questions before we go to the next slide? Okay, very good. So as we saw together, like why it's important, and I want to like highlight why handling the exceptions are very important. Like for better user experience, that's because you can give friendly messages to the user instead of error codes or the type of the exception. And sometimes the error message of the exception is not really like meaningful for non-tech people. So that's very important. Prevent the system from failure. For example, like as you saw, a simple example we had in the debug, execute anonymous. I was calling the method that will cause the error, but I had system.debug after, and maybe that will be other method or classes that we are calling. So you don't want to crash the system and stop everything. Sometimes you want to handle this exception. For example, you are trying to call multiple APIs for a certain record to get its latest. For example, you have another system that is the system of like the truth, like, or it has the latest data, and you have a record and you want to get the latest. Maybe I got the first, but the second failed, but I still want to get the third. If you don't have proper error handling or exception, maybe that will crash everything and you won't be able to. So sometimes the system failures as well stops and prevent the system from going or to behave the way you want if you're not handling it properly. Easier debugging, as I said, it's for the sake of like the session, we are just using the system.debug, but in real life, the best practice is to have like your logging capabilities that you agree on with your team, whether you create your custom code and custom utilities to log it, or you use another App Exchange app and use it to log the exception. And you need to have like something stable, something that you agree on with the whole team. So everyone is following the same. You don't do one way and the other developer do the other way. You need to have something similar and something standard along your team. So it's easier to look for the error and debug it and look what happened wrong. And its best practices, like it's one of the best practices is to know how to handle the exception, how to write it, and how to read the logs, and how to use meaningful messages, because like every code can break. And sometimes, even though you can have a very good developer, you have your scenarios and you tested edge cases, but sometimes like API call failed, timeout, the other system is not working as expected today. Sometimes things out of your control will happen. So if you don't have a proper management for the exception, again, that will disturb the system. Common scenarios that usually like you will see in like day-to-day work is some mathematical errors, like something wrong in the calculations that, like, for example, the divide by zero is causing an exception to happen. I have a class that I prepared. It's having like different methods that they can cause exceptions unexpected if we are not passing the right data. So let's say here, I will take here the first one, the math error, to show it to you. So if I call this method, it's static method, and I pass that I want to divide 10 by 0, that will be the similar as what we saw. It can give me math exception divide by 0, and it will stop. But if someone else call it with the proper input, I won't get the exception, and it will be executed, and I will see the exception, like the result properly of the division. So that shows to you like you never know. Like sometimes you write a code and you expect it to behave in a certain way, but sometimes like the user may enter values that is not like appropriate for you. Another type of exceptions that you will see is missing or invalid data. So for example, here, I have missing data error. This one is just selecting ID name from contact, where the email is the value that we are passing. So let me try it with you with an email that I don't know it. I know it doesn't exist in our org. So non-existing email. If I do that with this way I'm writing my query, that will return another type of exception called query exception, and it will tell me list has no rows for assignment to S object. So such, for example, error message, it's hard for non-technical and non-developer to understand that this means that we couldn't find this email and we don't have a contact with this email. So that's the type of messages like in you can face it with other scenarios that it can be the error message can be too difficult for someone end user or someone who's using your system to understand if you're not handling and returning a meaningful message. The same if I use like another email, that will work, no issues. And I will get, sorry, here I have the single quote extra. If I call it like that, I will get the contact, no issues. So the problem, it can be that you are missing the data, like someone is trying to get something and they thought it's there and 100% they are sure that it's there. For example, some orgs, they have like shipper account and they know this shipper account is the main account that they will be using when they ship the order. And sometimes they rely to get the account using this name, specific name. And we are sure that it will be always there. So we are using the name to get it, and we don't want to use a fixed ID because from org to org, the ID can be different. But someone by mistake change the name of the account at some point. It will lead to the same issue that we have here, that it tell me list has no record to return, and it won't be as clear. Another example, or like common errors that you would see is DML operation failures. And that's something I will show it to you here. But before doing that, the first one for the division, we had the type, let me show it to you here. I'll like when we get unhandled exception, it tells me first what's the type. I'm highlighting this because we'll see it like we can handle each type of exception separately, but that's another type or example. For the DML, like here, I can run this code and that I'm saying run DML error, and I'm giving the name of the account that I want to create null. So that should give me an DML exception because we cannot give or insert an account with empty name. So again, here we have a different type. It's DML exception, and the error is long. It's telling me exception on row 0, first error required. It can be more easily to understand than the other one that we just saw with the SOCO. But again, this would be easier to have these three lines of exception or error, or if we tell the user, sorry, you are missing the account name, please try again with a valid account name. That would be easier to understand for the user. Again, if I pass the proper account, that will be created. Another type is governor limits. We talked before, like Salesforce has a lot of governor limits. Some of them for the number of records you can return, some of them for the number of DMLs you can do, for the number of SOCLs you can run. And like we said before, we won't memorize it, but here Apex limits, governor limits. Limits, you can see it in this article. It's Salesforce article in their documentation. You can see how many records you can return, how many DMLs you can do, how many SOCO you can run, and so on. So here I have a bad practice. Just for demonstration, like we never do a SOCO statement within a for loop, but I just wanted to show to you, like for example, here, if I pass number of accounts and I do the SOCO, sorry, yeah, here I did 100 times, that didn't cause any issues. But if I, let's say 300, that would cause the 101 for the too many SOCO queries. This is a governor limit. And the type, again, it's different. It's system.limit exception. So again, those are just examples like of things that you can see, or exceptions. If they are not handled, you may see it in terms of the type and kind of the messages. Some of them math, some of them you're trying to get the SOCO or returning a record without, like, the data is not there in the org. You're trying to do a DML update, maybe delete something in the system, maybe a validation rule, duplicate rule, something will stop it and give you an exception. Governor limits. We have a lot of governor limits that we have to keep in mind in Salesforce, and sometimes going beyond these governor limits give you the limit exception as well. This is, again, just examples to demonstrate how the unhandled error can pop up, what are different options, how the messages can be different from one type to another, and how sometimes the message is very confusing to understand for non-technical people as well. Any questions so far? I'm checking the chat. We are good there. Okay. And API failures, that's something else as well. Like I don't have an example for it here with the beginner series, but like you can call another system to try to do an action, and API timeout, or you're passing incorrect data to the API and it will return an error or exception and doesn't do what you're expecting to do. So all of those are exceptions that can happen. When you write your code, sometimes you focus so much about the positive or how the system will behave with the positive scenarios, but sometimes we tend to forget like that sometimes the system can fail if someone else enter an invalid data, and you cannot control what the user will behave or how they will behave. So we always have to think about the edge cases and how we want our system to behave in terms of unexpected data or missing data or wrong input that they will enter for us. We have types of exceptions. So far, we saw together like math exception, we saw together limit exception, we saw DML, query exception. So all of those, I didn't define anything myself. Like you didn't see me going, defining, I want code with Sally exception or missing data exception. I didn't do anything. Those are system exceptions. They are built-in errors from Salesforce. This is, like, let me type it for you in the chat. This is a Salesforce, again, documentation. I love using Salesforce documentation because no one ever will memorize everything. But this is to give you an idea. We won't be going through all the types, definitely, but it will give you an idea what are the types of exceptions, like math exception, we saw it together. We saw the query exception when we tried to do a SOCO and data was not there and we are trying to return it in a single object. So there is a lot of them. And it's important to know that there is types, because sometimes how or what you want to do with the error can be different. Like if I get missing data or I get the query exception, maybe I want to do something. But if I get the limit exception, that's something more serious and I want to give a priority or create a task for someone to go check a certain record. Like maybe I would create a custom record in a custom object and create a task for someone to check it. So how to handle it can be different for each type. So we know that they are there. And also the documentation will show you, if you remember when we were discussing the integer, decimal, all the data types, we said they are classes and they have their own methods to handle them. Same here with the exceptions. There is common exception methods, like this will be available for regardless of the type of the exception. It's common, like there is a get message method, and we'll see it together. To get the message exception, you can get the line number calls. So you can use these methods to do like the logging you want to do in your custom object, for example, or even for the debug log. You can play with those messages and see what's the difference between them and your preference on which one to use. And also they have specific error messages for specific, methods for specific exception type. So those are specific to DML exception and email exception types methods. Again, if you need to use them, you know, they are there. There's some for the query exception. Like you don't have to go and memorize it. It just, you know, like they are there for you whenever you need. Okay. Sometimes as well, like all of that we said, it's system exception. It's defined by Salesforce. They are documented here in the in Salesforce documentation. But sometimes as well, like we want to do our own custom exceptions. Custom exceptions are defined by the developer to do specific logic, like, or we want to have code with any exception. Like instead of those types, I want to have a type called missing or required fields missing, or code with Sally. Again, having different types will help me when we go to how to handle the exception. I can handle each type separately. So that's why sometimes we need to have our custom exception, because in certain scenarios, maybe I will have an exception called minor exceptions, and another type I will name it major exception. And in terms of business, like if someone tried to create an order with the amount less than zero, that's a minor exception. It's just data entry. But for example, if someone failed to update, or they are trying to update in trying to clear the data of the account, and someone is trying to mess up like the system, maybe that will be a major exception. So you can define internally when you are working if you want to create your custom exceptions and being able to handle them. So, and we tried it before in one of the sessions, but we want to see it again today together. So let's try to create our custom exception. Uh, let's say I will create an exception for any missing data, missing required values. Or for example, if I'm creating an account and I want to enforce users to pass the industry and name, those are for me missing data. So I will create one that is generic. So I will go to Apex class and I will say missing required field exception. When you do that, okay, it exists. Okay, so the class, when you create it in developer console, and it's an let's say, let me create another one here. Missing required field values. And I created. When you created, and this is not happening when I do it when Visual Studio Code. When I create it from Visual Studio Code, it will just be public class and the name that you entered. When we do it from developer console, I notice that it does the extend for exception for me. So what if it's not there? You will just need to extend. And extend exception, if you remember when we discussed before, the object-oriented, that's inheritance. So exception is the parent class, and we are extending this to be our missing required field exception. So we are extending and we are using the inheritance concept to create our custom exception. So that's just to create the exception, but we didn't see how we can use it. Like, again, Salesforce will never throw an exception of type missing required field exception because that's a custom. Like Salesforce, we saw it like through exception of math exception, limit exception, and so on, because those are standard. But if you are doing this in custom, you have to throw it yourself. There is a question. So if using Visual Studio Code, we need to add extend exception. Correct. Yeah. If you try to create it in Visual Studio Code and you go to the class folder, right click, create new class, you would write the name for it and it will create just for you like this. So all you need to do is just add extend exception. So we know it's extending the parent class exceptions and we can use it to throw errors. So how we can throw errors, let me open account service here. That's the class that we had last time. And I want to show you another example for it. So here, I will add a method, another method. It's a static method. And we will say that I want to create an account and we'll be passing name and industry. We know that name is required. And if it's not passed, like Salesforce will give me an error and the account won't be created. But I want as well this to happen with the industry and I want to control how this will happen. So I can say here if string dot is empty, if the string that is coming is empty, and I can check that the string that I want to check is industry, I can here throw, right, throw, and create a new instance of my exception. So my exception is called missing required field. So I will do new and just give it the error. Industry value is required. Okay. And I can stop like that because the account will be handled by Salesforce. But again, if we are doing this, we want things to be standard. Any required field that I know it will cause the exception to happen, I can write it. So again, it's preference what you will do. But here I'm doing this and this. And then I can write here account, create my new account. So we are creating the account. We are saying use the values that is coming, the name and industry, and we'll insert. So what will happen when the code run is if the name or industry are empty, so let's say here it's empty, this will evaluate to true, it's if statement. So what will happen that the code within the curly brackets will be executed. So that will take us to throwing our custom exception. Same, if the name is empty, that will take us to throwing an exception with where it says the name value is required. And we'll see it until now, we are not handling it. So for example, here, let's see it in action so you understand more. So here I can do account. Missing required field exception, there isn't a question. This is a class. Missing required field exception is a class. So it's a class called missing required field exception, and it extends the exception class. So it's inheritance. We are extending the main exception class with our custom exception now. If the reason of the question is why we are doing a new here, this is we are doing a new instance. So when we were talking about inheritance, we said like, if you have a class and you want an object from it. So, and at the time we discussed that we have a car class and we want to have a Honda versus a Tesla object. So I will create an instance from it using the constructor. So in that case, I'm creating new and using the class name. So that's will create an instance for me from the exception. And here we are passing what's the value we want for the message. So here, if I try account.service and I try create account, and let me quickly comment those. And I would say here, I want new Tesla account. And I will say that the industry is empty. And I will try to execute. This now didn't give me an error. If I go to Tesla account, didn't give me an error, right? So if I go to debug, didn't give an error. Ah, okay. There is a duplicate rule that stopped it from happening, but see, we are not like, let's see, I want just to be clear what happened. Welcome to Salesforce, welcome. This is creating a task. So it should be there. Yeah, it just took time. It didn't give me an exception. I thought it gave an exception, but it's not. So new Tesla account got created. But in real life, my requirement was like, even though the industry is not required, I want to enforce it and I want to give an exception. And also, let me show you, if I enter here, the account name is empty. Now we are getting the unhandled and it's giving me the long message line 23, what is happening. And it's a long message that sometimes is very confusing. Okay, let's put those in back, like where we are checking if the industry or account is empty. And I will try now, let me save it first, and I will try to execute it. When we try to execute it, now we are not getting the first message that we got. We got now the custom exception. Like it's, and you will notice it doesn't start with system dot because it's not a system exception, it's custom. It tells me that it's line 15 through an exception and it's missing required field. And the message is easier to understand unless industry value is required. So if I test here banking and try again with the account, now it tells me name value is required and the type is missing required field exception. So that's, and again, it's still considered unhandled because I didn't handle what to do or how to behave when we get the exception. I just wanted for you to see what it means to throw an exception and what's the benefit of it. Like you can enforce certain business requirements. If something like, let's say if the name is longer than 10 character and we are in the IT industry, I don't want this. I want to give an exception that it's too long for this industry. Let's say it's like unrealistic, but maybe you want to do that. So I can do, if industry is IT and name is longer, through an exception that is too long. Or as we saw here, we are checking required fields for my case that I want to enforce, and I'm throwing an exception. So that's the difference between the system and the custom. Yet we didn't see how to handle it, but we are just understanding what is exception and how to throw it, and the difference between system and custom. Any questions so far? Okay. In the chat, no questions as well. Okay, let's move to the next slide. So now we saw together like certain types, and the types, like we didn't cover all the types like we have in the documentation, but we saw some of them, and we saw how we can define our own custom and how to throw it. We didn't see anything yet about how to handle. So that's the next topic. Like we want to know how we handle the exception and what's the syntax about it. So with the syntax, you will find that we have keyword called try, and you will have to open a curly bracket and close. Within this block or this try, you have the block where you will write the code that might cause an exception that you want to call and it may, or execute, and it may cause an exception for you, like calling one of the exception scenarios that doing the division or querying the record. And then we have the catch. Catch is a keyword, and you open a bracket and close it. And then here you define the type of the exception. So here we are using the generic, the parent, the exception, and we give it a name, EX. And then here, again, a curly bracket. Within those curly bracket is the code that you want to write to specify what you want to do with the exception. Write it in the bug log only. You have a custom object you want to insert it in. You have an AppExchange app that you installed and you will call its method. Send an email, create a task. Regardless of the requirement, you will do it here when the exception happens. Then finally, it's a block that it will always be executed regardless you have an exception or not. Like if no exception, after the code in the try get executed successfully and no exception, the finally will be executed. If in the try there is an exception and we catch it with the catch block, after the code in the catch get executed, the finally block and the code within the finally block will be executed. Why it's important or why we use it? We use it because sometimes, again, based on your requirements, you want to do certain actions or you want to do something regardless of the code got executed successfully or an exception happened. So it's a decision that you have to make if there is a need to have a finally block or not. Finally is not required. How many try and catch? And try is single. You will have it only once, but not in the code. Like before, like it's within the try is where the code that may cause an exception. The catch, you can have catch for math exception and another one for query exception and another one for the custom. And we usually end the last one to be the generic one. So let's try it together and see it here. So we want to try demo. Okay, try that catch demo. So let's try here the code that we have prepared. So I will just get the method and then we try it together. We'll start with catching the standard or like the system exception. So remember like the error handling scenarios that we saw and we tried to run in developer console. Now we'll put it here so we can like, I can share with you this class after and to have it more organized. So let's say here, I want to execute this code. What will happen? We'll come here, math error. When we pass divide by 0, it will give me an exception. So if I try now to call try demo.run scenarios, first, like what we did is that we had the try, like if I want to write it slowly with you, I will have here to try. That's the where we want to have the code that may cause an exception. So the code that may cause an exception is those methods that we created and we want to execute one by one. So that's why I have them within the try, because those are the line of codes when executed, I'm worried that they may pass or execute fine, or they may cause an exception. Then we start creating our catch. We can start with a simple catch. Let's remove it, all of that, and do it one by one. So I can try here to have a catch, a generic catch. So if I run now, let's save it. And I will have here my debug log will open. It will tell me unexpected error, divide by 0. So that will take me to where here. Let me close those. Okay, So that took me here that I tried to execute this, then it failed. It went to the catch. So the catch is a keyword. Between the bracket, we put the error, like the type of the exception, curly bracket, and we do whatever we want. Okay, let me try. We know that this is a math exception. So I will do another specific catch for that then. I will do a catch, and I will catch instead of the exception, the generic, I'm using the math exception. And we said this is one of the types of the exceptions we have in Salesforce. So it's one of the system. It's one of the system exception. There is a question. Yes, we know that this is one of the methods. Like there is a question, why do we know or how do we know that math error when we pass 10 and 0 would give an exception? Because this is the class that I just created and we tried to run one by one. And the math error was giving me like divide number 1 by number 2. So if number 2 is 0, it will give me an error. Maybe we can divide numbers and we can call it divide numbers to be more clear. And we can call it here divide number. So we know that when we pass for divide number to divide by 0, it will cause an exception. So, okay, it didn't save. Let me save it first here. Okay, and here then I will change it. So we know that this is a system error. Like, I don't know if I understand the question right, but when we divide by 0, that will cause the math exception, that is one of the system errors, to return because you cannot divide by 0. So if we pass 10 and 0 and Salesforce try to execute 10 divided by 0, that will throw an exception, a system exception, and it will be that of type math exception. When we didn't have the math exception here and we tried to execute it, we got unexpected error in the message here. I want to show you that you can handle different types. So we added here a catch math exception, and I'm catching the math exception, and I will say instead of unexpected error, I will type math error. So if I try to execute this now and try to run it, I will get that I have math error divide by 0. So now I'm able to handle this in this block of this catch. I'm catching this type and I'm handling it. So you can control how you want to handle, what type of message you want to return, or what's the action you want to do in that case. So it's very specific for that. If I try now, let's say this one, non-existing. We tried this in the developer console and we were getting query exception because we are trying to return a contact with an email that doesn't exist. So that will give me an exception. Now, this type is query exception. Anyone can tell me when I will run the code, will we get math error and the error, or will get unexpected error? You can type your answer in the chat or just tell me out loud. Okay, no guesses so far. The exception type here is query exception. So what will happen is when the exception is thrown, it's type query exception. Salesforce will come and say, okay, can I catch it here? Is it of type math exception? Like as if it will say if statement, query exception equal math exception. Is it math exception? Is the type math exception? The answer is no. So if there are any other catches to try, no, it will go and be caught in the unexpected. So if I try now to run this, we'll get it in the unexpected error because I don't have the type for it specifically. We can have another catch to catch it specifically. I can add, instead of math exception, I can do catch query exception. So it's another type. So this one will fail, but when it come here, it will say, okay, is it a query exception? The answer will be yes. So it will go to the catch here and will execute this line of code. And because we caught it already, this one will not be executed. So one of them will be executed. So if we have a specific catch here, it will happen first, and that's it. If we don't, it will go to the catch. So if I try it now and try a demo, I will find that we have the query error in that case because I caught the specific type and I handle it the way I want. And the thing that we need to know that it's a very good idea always to have a generic catch at the end. Sometimes people don't do the specific and just rely on the catch. It's your call to do that. Whether you need to catch, like if at the end, regardless of the type, I'm logging the error the same way, I'm doing the same action, then there is no need to have different catches. But let's say I want in some cases to do an extra step, to do a task, to send an email, to do something, and I want to separate them, then I have to do it. I know we are at time. I will just continue this topic and I will pause and we'll continue next time. And if anyone has to go, like maybe you watched the last couple of minutes in the recording. So that's like how we catch it. The finally, I want to show it to you. The finally, I will say system.debug and finally code to be executed. So here, regardless of the type and regardless of which catch will go through, the finally will be executed. And even if there is no exception, it will go to the finally. So let's try it here together. Here I'm running the scenarios. This will pass. This will give me an exception. And so we'll see query error, and then you will see the finally. So I will see here the query error, then finally. Let's try it as well with another way where I will just comment this, enable this. This is an email that we have in the org. If I try now, this should be executed, no issues. This should be executed, no issues. And let me comment those. So I just want to execute those two. If I try now, both of them will be executed, no issues. I got the division, I got the contact, and still the finally code to be executed got executed as well. So that's the benefit of finally, that it's a piece of code that will be executed whether you have an exception or not. At the end of the catch will be executed. Why we need, someone sometimes ask like why we need different catches. Sometimes like you want to differentiate, for example, that the payment failure in a system, maybe you will ask the user to try another payment method. For example, if we are doing ordering purchase system online, versus if the payment gateway, there is a network issue, maybe you will tell them, okay, try again later, and you don't need to notify anyone. Sometimes you want, if a product is out of stock, maybe you want to give them a suggestion to use another product. So sometimes the catches may be needed to handle or to behave differently in different scenarios. So that's one. Finally, we need it because, for example, regardless, someone is ordering, the order passed or failed, I want to notify someone that there was a trial to do an order and it got purchased successfully or it failed. So I need to, regardless, failure, exception, yes or no, I want to send an email. So sometimes you need to do that. The last thing I will show it to you today, and then we'll continue next time. I want to show you like how we can catch a custom exception. So let me put this method for you here. Create and log account. So we have, if you remember here, the account service, we created this method together and we added the custom exception to through it for required industry or required name. So here I will do the try, and within the try, this is where I put the code that may give me an exception. So that would be calling create account. I'm trying tech for Thursday, for example, an empty industry. And I would catch, did I get any missing required exception? I would say custom exception code. Then finally, I will log account creation attempted, regardless it was successful or not. So, and as well, on top of that, I need to add here a generic catch, unexpected error, and write it, because we said like it's a good practice, even if you have a generic at the end, to have a unhandled exception as well to catch any error. And I will show you an example to prove it why. So if I try this now, and instead of doing this, I will do create and log. Now, in the debug log, you'll find that I did custom exception caught, and we logged in the finally. So what happened is that when we created the account and we have the industry empty, that generated a custom exception for missing required fields. And that took me to the catch here. That's how you can, like we saw together how we create a custom exception and how to throw it. And this is how you catch it. Like it's not different than any other type. It just, instead of using one of the types that is system exception, you're using the type of your custom exception. The reason why I'm saying we need to have a catch, a generic, because let's say here, I will do the math exception and I will remove the catch. What will happen in that case? Will we get any error? Let's think about it. Sorry, this is not the one that I wanted. I will remove the catch, the generic, and I will remove the math as well. So what will happen here? That when I go to divide by number, that will throw a math exception. So it will come here. Is it a math exception? The answer is no. So it won't be caught. So let's try it together. Because there is no type math exception and we don't have the generic as well. So we couldn't match it. So it will give me the system math exception. Like it will give you the, it will be handled as unhandled exception. It's not a handled exception anymore because you are catching a specific type, which is query exception. And this is of type math exception. So if you come here, is this a math exception? The answer will be no, because it's math exception and this is a query exception. So it will be ignored. Do we have a generic catch? The answer is no. So that's why it will give you and it will behave as if you have unhandled exception. So it's very critical to add this catch generic to handle any unhandled exception in case it happened and you are not catching the specific type correct. So that's when you have the unhandled or the catch generic came here. So that's just to give you an idea on the types and how we can use the try and catch. And finally, you can have more than one catch. You cannot have like finally is optional. You must have a catch, like you cannot have a try without a catch. You must have at least one catch block. Or finally, also, let's say here, I believe if I try to move this to be at the top here, it will give you an error. Let's try it because it's the most generic, so it will be matched to it. So this code will never be reached. exception type already caught. Like it tells you, like you don't need the query exception anymore because you already caught it with the generic, which is the exception. Fimi, you have a question? I can see you are unmuted, but I can't hear you, so it's very hard to hear you. You can type your question in the chat and I'd be happy to answer you. But it's giving me this error because the exception is the parent class. You remember when we extended to create our custom, we extended the exception. So this is the most generic. So if I put the most generic at the top, it will match any exception that will happen. So that means this is not needed because it will never be executed. We already caught it with the exception. So if you will be using the exception, it has to be the last catch. Otherwise, it will give you this error. Math exception was caught by custom exception when no written exception math error. No. When we have here, when I removed this, what happened is that when we got the divide by 0 and we tried to, the exception happened, the code came here. Is math exception, is a query exception? The answer is no. So it couldn't find any catch that can match with it because we don't have the generic, we don't have the math exception. So what happened that it handled the exception as if it's unhandled exception. So what will happen, it will give me the exception, unhandled exception, with the exception of what we have here. So the same, like if I do math exception first, and let's remove the query, and I do this one. Here we were giving a nice message that the account does not exist or contact does not exist. Now I will get the very ugly message like list has no rows for assignment to as object because it's not match, it's not a math exception, it's query, and we don't have the generic. So it treated it as unhandled exception. Like if I put this back here and try it again, you didn't get the pop-up with the exception, and we got the message saying math divide by 0. Okay, I didn't, we want to run this. I will comment the divide by 0 and we have the query. We didn't get the pop-up with the list has no rows, but we got, for example, here we can give it a message, nicer message instead. Missing rows here. Instead of this one, we can log in the object this message, but we can say record not found. So you see the difference. If I do this now and execute, like you didn't get the pop-up and you got the message saying record not found. So you can, when you're using like the catch, you can control which error message will be displayed. You can enter like a very friendly error message and use the get message to save it in the object. The main thing is I want to make it clear, like if you don't have a matching catch, it will behave as if it's unhandled exception. So it's always advisable like to add a generic catch at the end, and it has to be the last. If you put it on like the first second, it will give you an error that the other types won't be needed because you're already catching it with the exception. Do we have to put all the code within the try and catch here? The answer would be it depends on like what you want to achieve. So where you place the try and catch and how you place it and what's the code in between has a great impact on how the code will behave and what's the output. So let's assume like I have this scenario. If the divide number fails, I still want to do missing data error or to try to get the context. So in that case, I can do as follows. Like I can do here a try and close it. And let's try together. So I will try here and close it. Then I will do the divide number. I can have it here with a generic catch and finally and everything. And then I can have another try that within this try, I will put the second method that I have missing data error. So what will happen here? Let me save and show it to you. So what will happen here is that I will try to run the divide number. So it will fail. It will go check, is it a math exception? The answer is yes. So it will run math error and enter finally code if we need it. Then after that, it will continue the code. So it will continue the try and it does the missing data error. And in that case, we are passing a valid email that we'll get. So we'll get as well the contact. So here, this will fail and this will pass and we'll second finally to, for example, run. So let's try together and see it. And as well, the system.debug I have after the call will be executed too. So I will do here debug. I got the exception, the first finally for the first try and catch block. And then the contact, I tried to get it. I got it. And then the second finally, then the Sally debug statement as well got executed. So if I put this back and remove those and try it again, like we have a single try and catch. So what will happen here, when the try will happen, this will throw an exception. So once it threw an exception, all the code after it will be ignored. And I will start checking, is it a math exception? Yes, this will be printed, the finally, but I will never get the contact in that case. And the Sally will be executed after because we have handled the exception and the code after this call can be still executed. So if I try here, I will get the divide by 0, the finally code, the check, the debug statement I had. We didn't get the contact, and the reason is because we said we have everything in the try. So after this got an exception, everything after got ignored. So I just wanted to showcase for you what's the impact of the try and catch. Also, as an example to compare, if I remove, so I don't have a try and catch, now it's unhandled exception. What will happen when I call this? It will have an exception. Everything after will be ignored as well. And the debug statement here will be ignored. It won't be executed. Like we didn't get the debug log, the debug Sally would not execute. Everything got terminated because it's unhandled exception. So the handling the exception is very important because it helps you to be able to continue executing your code, whether you need this or not. It's something you have to think about. Like you may have a need to create an account, and after the account is created, you create a contact. So if the account is failing, you don't want to call the contact. But let's say I'm creating a account in students from a list that the user sent me. If the accounts failed, I still want to try to run the student. So things like that make you think like how you will place your try and catch. Definitely, we want to have a try and catch. We want to avoid unhandled exceptions, but we have to think like where we want to have the try and catch, because where you will place your try and catch will impact how your code will behave. So you have to think carefully if you want to fill everything, if you want to still finish some piece of code and be able to execute it, or what should happen. So in next session as well, like we'll talk about even the rollback and save point, and how if I created an account and then I failed to create the contact, how I want to roll back. I don't need the account as well created. In that case, sometimes we need to do that as well. So we'll talk more about how and where you position your try and catch and how this will impact the implementation. So that was a question, like we had a nice discussion about it, and we had more examples, but this is in summary what was asked. What's the benefit of try and catch? So to summarize, the try and catch give you control over how you want your system to behave instead of like just failing everything and stopping everything from running. You can pick and choose how it will behave by where you will place your try. Like as you saw here, having everything within this same try block. If this fails, everything will be ignored. When we separated them into two blocks, even if one failed, the other one got executed. So sometimes you have to think about that and decide whether you want them to fail or not. And we'll look into that further next time as well. And we'll see an example as well for how you can roll back the data if you have related records or different operations, DML operations that you execute, and you want to roll back everything if the last step failed, for example. So it's very powerful. It's very important. We want to be mindful about the usage of try and catch and where to place it, because where you put it and how you use it can impact how your code will behave. So that's very important. If you have questions, please send it to me. I'll try to answer it during the week or next session, but please let's make sure that everyone understand how try and catch work and how it impacts the execution. And it's very important to know the try is required, the catches, you can have only like here, you can have 0 catches, but like again, how it will behave like as if it's unhandled, because you don't have any catch to catch it. So even if Salesforce allows you to write the try and finally, I would still have the catches. We need to have, in my opinion, or what I like to do, we need to always have the exception, the generic catch exception. If you want to have specific like those, you can, if you have a different behavior for it. If not, the generic is enough. And as we saw earlier, you cannot have the generic at the top because it will give you an exception because the rest will be ignored. Next time, we'll talk about where to handle exceptions, something other stuff more specific of when to write the try and catch, how it will behave with the try and catch or without. And we'll have more examples to go through. Thank you so much for anyone who joined the session live or anyone who's watching the session online. And I will see you with a new session next week. We'll continue our discussion with exception handling. And if you have any questions, send me on Slack or LinkedIn. I will do my best either to answer you during the week or to come prepare for you next session to answer your questions.